Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Jason again. It's good to be with you this snowy morning here in upstate New York. And this morning, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what I think is probably the most important chapter of the Bible. And saying it's the most important chapter of the Bible is kind of like saying, it's one of the 10 most important rock albums in the world. It's all kind of relative. There's 10, you can't really rate them. They all have their own things that make them important and influential, and really your top 10 list is really probably about 15 or 20 if you're like most of us. So when I say I want to talk about the most important chapter of the Bible, I do realize that what we have in the scriptures is a lot of really essential, important pieces. But this chapter that we're going to talk about this morning, and it is one of those essential things. If you don't understand what's going on in this chapter, you really don't understand who God is. You don't understand who Jesus is. You don't understand what our role as people is and where we're supposed to be going. And if we do get it right, then you do get a better understanding of who God is. You get a better understanding of what Jesus is all about, and you get a better understanding of who you're supposed to be and what God is doing in your life. And so the chapter that we're coming to this morning is actually Genesis chapter 1. This chapter has been an amazing lifeline for me. It has shaped my understanding of the gospel. It has shaped my understanding of what God is doing. And I think we need to spend more time sitting in Genesis chapter 1 than we spend sitting in a lot of other places in the scriptures, because it is essential and it is foundational, and it does give the entire scriptures this kind of overall pattern and narrative and arc that makes it make a whole lot more sense than if we start in other places in the scriptures. So interesting as I sit here and I think about it, and about Genesis chapter 1, there's a huge amount of debate in the world about Genesis chapter 1, and I'll tell you what, though, it's got nothing to do with science. It's got nothing to do with creationism. It is what it is a chapter that was, I believe, put into the scriptures, into the Old Testament, towards the end of the completion of all what we call the Old Testament, and what Jewish believers would call the Tanakh, and that's the three different parts of what we call the Old Testament. And I think it was written towards the end, probably in the exile or probably after the exile. And what it was added to the canon by those writers and those compilers and those editors to really help make sense of what the whole story of what God is doing through the nation of Israel is all about. I think what we call Genesis really probably properly begins sometime in chapter 2, and chapter 1 is kind of like a summary of the whole story. This is what it's all about. This is what God has been doing, and this is where God is taking us and what God is doing with us as the people of God, the nation of Israel. And I think that summary statement kind of carries over into the New Testament, and it goes along those lines of giving us what God is doing with the world, with people in general, with the church for us in specifics. And so again, it is foundational and it is essential, and it is, like I said, it's a summary of the whole point of what God has been doing and where God is going. And so let's think about the chapter. It starts out with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. It was full of chaos. There was no life in it. And God spoke, and let there be light. And then light came into being. And I think that really sets the tone for it. It presupposes that the story that we're living in as the people of God is a story where the world is broken, where things aren't right, where chaos happens. And God's first act, they want us to know, was that he stepped into that chaos. He stepped into that brokenness. He stepped into that world that was in chaos, and he brought life. He brought order. He brought connection and restoration. It doesn't start with the world was chaos and full of void and chaos, and God destroyed it all and started fresh. No, it says he stepped into the midst of what was broken, and he brought order and life to it. And I think that's an essential component that we need to understand, is that the story of God isn't a story of him wiping things out, but it's a story of him stepping in the midst of the brokenness and bringing life and bringing order and bringing restoration. And I don't know if you noticed, but when you read chapter one, it is it's kind of this progressive poem, right? Each day of creation is in, God created this, and saw that it was good, and that was the first day. And then God created this and saw that it was good, and that was the second day. And on, it kind of goes this way. And I think as we think about the story and we think about in terms of God knows that our world, that our lives, that everything is broken and is a mess, we are so quick to want to condemn ourselves, and we're quick to want to condemn the world and say that it's without hope, and its only answer is to get its light act together and do right, and if it does right, it'll be pleasing to God. I think going back to Genesis chapter 1 reminds us that no, as God is bringing life and bringing hope into the world, it's this ongoing, progressive kind of thing that as we turn to Him for help in the midst of the brokenness and the chaos and the void that is our lives, God steps in and makes transformations, and it happens in bits and pieces, but it happens because we're turning to Him, and He's at work doing the things that He does about loving us and providing for us and caring for us. It's really a beautiful story of grace. I mean, it's not, hey, I dealt with it, so now do right, or that's it. It's a matter of I've dealt with what's wrong, and I'm continually bringing life and bringing peace and bringing hope and bringing direction into the world. And I think as we look at that story and we read that Genesis chapter there and we look at it, we do see a little bit about what our lives are supposed to be like. Our lives are supposed to be lives that are lived as being reflections of God and reflections of His love in our world. Because it says, later on in the chapter there, it says that God created people in His own image, and that they're supposed to subdue the earth, and they're supposed to care for the earth. And I kind of realize that what he's talking about there is that we're supposed to love God's world the way that God loves His world. And that means to step into the midst of the chaos and the brokenness and be tangible expressions of His love. That's what the call of the people of Israel was. And so when the editors who compiled our Old Testament sat down at the end of looking at everything, said, this is who we're supposed to be. We were chosen to be a nation, to be blessed by God, where we can turn around and be a blessing to the world. And that's the call that goes out to Abraham, right? When God calls Abraham later in Genesis, it says, I'm going to make you my people. Your descendants will be innumerable, and they will be blessed where they can be a blessing. And so the writers and the compilers of the Old Testament look back at and say, this is what the story is about. This is who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be a people who are blessed by God, who draw near to God and live in right relationship with God, where we can in turn be a blessing to those around the world around us. And I think we come to the New Testament and we see that's the same story that Jesus talks about, right? Jesus says, what in the New Testament, that what are the greatest commandment? What is the greatest commandment? Someone asked him that question, and he says, what the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Really to love God with our whole being, to depend on Him and trust in Him. That's the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. The second is just as important, I think, is what he's saying. It's essential just like that. It's not a one or the other. It's really these two things are what you're supposed to do, and that's to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think he's extrapolating out on what the call of the people of Israel was, what His call as the Messiah was to love God with his whole being and to love the world the way that He does, and to give us a means for God to be at work bringing life to us and to redeem us and restore us and deal with our sin, where the Spirit can breathe into us and give us this new life. But I think it all flows back to that understanding that happens in Genesis chapter 1, is that you have this poem that the writers are talking about, where God creates the heavens and the earth, and He progressively, step by step, makes it just right, where people can live and flourish and have life, and they can be in relationship with God. And I think that is that is that first, to love the Lord your God, right? It's to live in love of God and dependence on God. And as we look at Genesis chapter 1, there's really that laying that out in there, that God's done all this stuff to provide for us, where we live in love of him and love as others. And then we come to that latter part of chapter 1 where it creates humans in his image, and he says, for them to subdue the earth, to love the world the way that he does. And that's the second of those two commands, right? It's to love your neighbor as yourself. We're to be tangible expressions of God in our world. And that's the story of what God is doing. That's the story of who we're supposed to be. And it's a story of full of grace and full of provision by God for us in every step along the way. That our lives are broken oftentimes, that we miss the mark, we sin, we fail to be a people who love God with our whole being. We fail to be a people who are tangible expressions of God's love, but God is at work in us step by step, day by day, as we turn to him and depend on him and trust in him. He's drawing us to himself. He is at work transforming us from the inside. He's given us, I think it says in Ezekiel, he takes out our heart of stone and gives us a heart of flesh. He gives us new life in him. And Paul picks up some of this kind of idea and says, that the law of the Spirit of God has set you free from the law of sin and death. And so God is at work in us, transforming us. And I think it's really easy for us as followers of God to get down on ourselves, because we do sin, we fall short. And I don't think we just excuse it and pretend it doesn't matter, because it does matter. God has called us to draw near to him, and God has called us to love others as we love ourselves. And when we do those two things, we find hope, we find happiness, we find wholeness in ourselves. But he knows that we're broken and that we're flawed, and that there's those places that we just can't do it on our own, because there's this chaos and this void and this brokenness inside of us. But he's at work out of his mercy and his grace, stepping into the midst of that. And he tells us to draw near to him, to let him be the one who's at work in us. We don't have to white knuckle it. We don't have to force ourselves with external acts to be faithful. We don't have to please God out of fear that he's going to be disappointed in us. We have to rest in the reality that this good God, who stepped into the chaos of a broken world and brought it to order to bring life and to provide for a people who would reflect his love to the whole of creation, that he's doing that very same thing in us. He's drawing near to us and healing us and transforming us as we let him be at work in us to be that person. And so when we fail and we stumble, because that's what we're going to do when we live out the chaos and the brokenness, our act of repentance is to turn to God and say, God, please be with me. Please help me. Please transform me and shape me into the person who loves you with my whole being and loves my neighbor as you do, who loves your world the way that you do. And bit by bit, as we continually go back to him for help, for rescue, for salvation, for transformation, he continues to refine us. He continues to shape us. He continues to make us into those reflections that reflect what Jesus did when he came and perfectly fulfilled that calling, and reflect what God's intention was from us from the beginning, from when he created the heavens and the earth, was to have a people who were pleasing to him and were faithful to love others the way they do. So as we close this morning, I just want to encourage you to not beat yourself up and to not get so caught up in the places where you stumble and when you fall, but to get caught up in going back to Genesis chapter 1 and going back to the rest of the scriptures after that and looking at them through the lens of Genesis chapter 1 and see that God is at work in you. God is at work in me, changing us and transforming us bit by bit and bringing us to life where we can be tangible expressions of his love, his light, and his life to our neighbors. That's the gospel story. That's what Jesus did. Jesus came in and dealt with the chaos and the brokenness in our lives and in our world, finally and fully, and defeated those dead places, those void, chaos, broken places that we're a part of. And he dealt with it and did away with it. And that when we turn to him and let him pour his Spirit into us, and we let him shine his light into those broken places, and when we let his healing love work inside of us, we are a people that are finding healing, we're finding restoration, we're finding hope. And then in turn, flowing out of that work that God is doing inside of us bit by bit, we see that he is showing his love to the world through us. So go out of here today living in the light of the gospel that says that God has done whatever is necessary to bring you to life, to bring me to life, to bring a community of his people to life, to be blessed by him, where you can be a blessing to the world. Amen. Enjoy your day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.